different bedrooms and households together. It seems to be millions of households starting to connect. So welcome everyone. My name's Gilbert, and I'm the founder of Village Well. We're a placemaking firm, and I'm based in Melbourne, but originally born in Mauritius. And I had a great session with the team, Hey Dee and Michelle this morning, and rich discussions. And really what I like to do is just share a few insights of, I suppose, the journey so far in my life. But I think, you know, who would have thought all the things that I've been envisioning for the last 30 years would be happening in the last 3 weeks? Quite extraordinary. So, it's take the romance out of it. It's an extraordinary, profound time, and I want to share some of those insights of what are the gems of that new story. I think is worth starting a dialogue around now, because in some ways it's going to be a battle of stories as the normal or the new normal or whatever normal that starts to appear in the next 6 to 12 months, and what dialogue we have around that is going to be quite critical. But before I start in sharing some of those insights, I'm a percussionist. I'm always got a drum not too far from me. So what I've got right with me is my drum called Pumpkin. So it always, that's what makes my heart sing, drumming. So what I'm going to get you to do is to stand up and move your body a little bit. So I'm going to get you all to stand up, even if I don't see your faces, and then pretend you're in a washing machine and you're moving around. This is a bit of Sega dancing from Mauritius. Beautiful. Michelle, you win the prize. And and then what I want you to do about at least 5 times, repeat after me, and with a lot of passion. Chugga, 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 choo, choo, chugga, 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 choo, choo, choo. Ready?
Chugga, chugga, choo, choo, choo.
Well, ready, set, go. Chugga, 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 choo, 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 chugga, chugga, chugga. No, go,
choo,
go.
choo, choo. Chugga, chugga, chugga.
Beautiful. Okay, have a seat. Well, it's all about energy, folks. So, all right, let's start. And where do we start? So, look, I think just also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'm living on Wurrunoi and Wurundjeri land, and really just to acknowledge we're living with the oldest continuous wisdom on the planet. I think there's a lot of deep learnings in essence. And in Australia, we have the youngest multicultural community on the planet. So there lies a story in itself, the oldest continuous wisdom on the planet and the youngest multicultural community on the planet. And what a time to be alive. And, you know, I'm calling this, and some of my colleagues are calling this, the time of the great pause, or the deep reflection. And I think it gives us an extraordinary time to reflect on what is important, and possibly what is that new story. And my teacher, Joanna Macy, who's a deep ecologist, you know, she refers this time as the time of the great turning, as we're moving away from an extractive story, an extractive economy, an extractive life, to one that nourishes life. And I think that's the essence of the new story. It will nourish life. And I really want to say that, in one sense, the old story, as the Buchanan Institute says, is going to go into some form of a hospice mode. You know, it's declining so rapidly, and you know, the financial and structural elements of this system, as it goes downhill and dismantles itself, we're in a moment of what I call a major reset and recalibration of society and its institutions. So very rarely the legitimacy of our institutions are questioned at the same time, or they lose their legitimacy at the same time. So those institutions being government, business, and the church have pretty much lost their legitimacy. And so in that sense, we've lost our foundations, and we're looking for a new story. So what will hold this other set of values and behaviours in this time? So who would have thought, when we were talking this morning, we were sharing that, there'll be dolphins in Venice. And where I live, there's been hundreds of white cockatoos just flying in the city, coming back, and the quietness and the fresh air coming into so many countries. But obviously with that comes a level of anxiousness as well as all the great good news stories. There's an extraordinary website called The Kindness Pandemic that's really pouring in millions of great things that are happening on the planet as we're reconnecting to our communities, our families. In Australia, seedlings have been sold out, chickens have been sold out, beehives have been sold out. It's extraordinary how people are coming back to really what matters. So I want to share what if the old system is going into hospice, we're going to need a lot of compassion and care to transform this system into the new story. And I think we're going to need a level of pioneering and illuminating, to use that word, of what is the new story. So the virus gives us an interesting opportunity to reset. And dare I say, I feel like the COVID-19 virus is a practice run to climate change. We're getting a small moment, and it could be 3, 6, 12 months to start rethinking of how we're going to build a much more resilient society and resilient self. So some of those 7 elements that I just want to share really starts to reframe what I call the foundations for this new story. And I think the first one is regenerative. We're the regeneration. And I think that when I talk about regenerative, we have to move towards a more regenerative lifestyle. And I think we've moved away from being just trying to make a sustainable world towards a more regenerative world where we put back more than we take out. And that's the first principle. And we're looking at a very systems view of the world. So that, I would say, is the first principle, the regenerative worldview. And you can see that in regenerative agriculture, regenerative architecture, regenerative communities. It's a very exciting field. And we can see a lot of the pioneers in transition towns and retro suburbia really, really moving that. Dare I say, I just want to reframe and go back a step, is that we're good people in a badly designed system, good people in a badly designed system. So it's a major systems redesign. And I think the regenerative systems approach will be a great foundation for that. The second pillar, I think, is how do we devolve power back to the community as part of that pillar of that new story? So really, power with and not power over. And there's many processes of deliberative democracy and lots of other processes that are saying that we're putting citizens first. And I think that's going to be critical. And hopefully we'll see councils becoming more enabler facilitators and getting out of the way for this to happen. A third pillar, and I'm just quickly going through all these, we could talk to hours to these, but is the concept of cosmo-localization. And dare I say, we can call it glocalization, where we're going into a hyper-local narrative in the future. We're seeing countries resetting their manufacturing agenda. It's almost like they're scrambling to reset, what's important in terms of manufacturing the essentials for their own economies. So we'll start to see thousands of new businesses appear in the next few years that are very hyper-local and place-based and very much a place-based economic agenda. The fourth pillar is, which my friend Michelle Bowens is a leader in, is called what I call the return to the commons and commoning. In some ways, we'll become commoners again, and the importance of that whole shareable city and shareables and that gifting economy, which is really needed so much at the moment. And I think we're starting to see an underground surge of that happen everywhere as people are gifting, especially to the more vulnerable groups in society. That has a whole systems approach again to what I call that regenerative agenda. what's been interesting, speaking to about 20 of my private sector clients, it feels like a major reset for the largest and most powerful institution on the planet, and that's business and, you know, and companies. So I think there'll be a new era of social responsibility and ethical conduct appearing, and banks will have to reset, you know, their larger purpose in serving society and serving citizens. So I think what we're seeing here is governments, neoliberal governments who were serving companies have suddenly become socialist governments. It's quite extraordinary, because they want to save the economy, but they know they have to almost build in a universal basic income. So the other, the fifth pillar or sixth pillar is, I think, what we're starting to see is a collective self-awareness of that we live on in this beautiful, fragile blue planet, our Earth, and our mother is the Earth, the spaceship Earth, and really that we become more stewards. And so that's a real shift in consciousness, as Joanna Macy says. You know, those three areas of the great turning will be the holding, you know, protecting our life support systems. The second element will be shifting our systems and working in those institutions, because it takes decades to create new institutions. We don't have the time. This is the decade. And then the third one is that shifting consciousness. So I think that's an exciting moment as well in humanity. Only going to take 3 to 5% of humanity to shift. That will create a major tipping point. So I think that my sense is that will happen in the next 3 to 6 months, especially if we get locked down for the next 3 to 6 months. There's going to be a lot of reflection time to shift those values. The other key one is that the new economics and the new economics of place. And here we're starting to see, you know, the universal basic income being spoken about, but not only spoken about, we've seen that in Finland as an experimentation, or in Iceland, but even in Spain in the next 2 weeks, we'll be seeing the introduction of that. And even in Australia, for the next 6 months, 6 million Australians will get a universal basic income, which is, who would have thought 3 weeks ago that would have happened? Quite extraordinary. And it's going to be very hard to wind some of that back. So given the amount of unemployment that we're going to find. So in some ways, we're in that pivotal transformative moment that we're birthing this new story, and in that return to what I call radical simplicity, or elegant simplicity. I suppose consumerism is sort of dismantling itself, and we're getting to that conscious consumerism and built to last element. So how do we prepare our citizens and communities for this new story, I ask myself, and I think that's a big question. I think, you know, we are in that hospice stage where the dismantling of the old story, and how do we really nurture and nourish the new story to be born. But I do see elements of extraordinary good news stories. And I think we've seen that with transition towns and the transition town movements, and how communities are coming together. They form a template of how communities can work together and mobilize. I think retro suburbia is another great template from the permaculture movement. And, you know, the concepts of food and energy security, but really that goes back to power with components, where communities are driving these changes. It's coming from a massive grassroots swell. And also, even in Australia, we've got a concept called town teams, and where community, government and business come together, but it's community driven to revitalise their towns and communities. So the other one that really inspired me was the block captains. You know, like in Philadelphia, there's still 9,000 block captains. And I think after Katrina and Sarah, some of those great hurricanes in New York, they realized, you know, we needed the concept of an individual in each block that could connect an ecosystem of a town and a neighborhood and a city. And each block understood its needs and connected to its fellow citizens. So it gets to that grassroots elements. So what are the key things needed now, I suppose, to really give birth to that new story? So one of my key elements, I think we need to become more, especially councils need to become what I call facilitator enablers. We need to create the conditions, especially they're the closest democratic force to our citizens. And I think what we do need in the next 3 to 6, 12 months is very inspiring community resilience plans, almost like they're a mix of transition towns and retro suburbia together, but they're community driven. And I think what we'll find is that we'll start to see citizens invest, even with their super funds, and we're starting to see this, in their own towns, not in some global casino. So we'll start to really unlock our investments. So I think that's a really exciting condition to bring in that hyper-local, cosmo-local innovation platform. And as I said before, I think in that cosmo-local globalization principle, there'll be thousands, if not millions, of new small businesses, including NGOs and citizen-led initiatives that will create a new sense of place. And what I read an article a few months ago, I think it was by KPMG, that by 2040, I think they mentioned that 50% of all global manufacturing will be local. 50% of all global manufacturing will be local, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, that's with 3D printers and a whole heap of vast new technologies. But what it does say is that we start to get, we can really reduce our carbon footprints and create real place-based economies and also great livelihoods on top of that. But we were going to need a real shift with governments, both state and federal governments, to create the policy levers to incentivize this emergent story in architecture, in finance, in health, in agriculture. So what's going to come from that is citizens leading the way. And I think that's the exciting thing. So the other key thing that I've got excited about is I suppose, the return to the commons and public spaces. My sense is when this settles down, or when we start to find a vaccine, there's going to be a huge wave of deep reconnection and with a new set of values. And that will be through reconnection to our public spaces, our institutions, but more importantly, we'll start to see both, our streets, our towns, our market towns, our laneways re-inhabited by new ways of being and hopefully new innovations. One of my exciting insights and that I've seen in the last couple of years is if you think of Uber and Airbnb being a platform, and it's a capitalist platform. In Bendigo, where Dee lives, there's a group called Beehive, and that's a platform cooperative. And one of the first, and I think this is where, if you Google Beehive, platform cooperatives, so imagine a group of citizens coming together and putting money together and owning this platform, and they've got their Airbnb, they've got their Ubers, but it's community owned and all profits go back to the community. So I think these concepts are going to be quite powerful in the future. So just to finish off, and I'm mindful I want to get some discussions out there, I think, so what does the new leadership look like in this time of the great turning of this new story? And what are we going to need personally to rethink our ways of being? So I think the first one, we need to think in systems. Yeah, we need to think in more holistic ways, that regenerative framework, that everything is radically interconnected. So that's going to change everything of how we see things. So it's going to break that old concept of the I to the we. The second component is acting as great collaborators, and I call that, collaborating for the commons or for the common good. So we're going to see new governance systems like town teams and lots of others come into form. And I think that's very exciting, where community has a sense of their own power. The third one, which I mentioned before, we need to become very skilled facilitators and holders of space. Very important, I think, because we're the pioneers and we're the birth mothers and birth fathers of this new story. and we're hospicing the old story with great compassion and insight and care and love. We're going to need great facilitation skills, and which brings me to the fourth element, which I think is great inner skills. The inner life will be coming to the fourth. And that collective inner life, I think, is going to be quite important in how we learn to work and listen to each other and unleash a great collective self-awareness. I suppose I am calling forth a greater collective spirituality. You know, our Indigenous elders always lived in the spirit world, that they lived in a living and loving, breathing universe. And the universe story was in that frame. So I think as humanity shifts their thinking towards a more interbeing focus, it's more than the human-centric. And then we're starting to see the non-humans having rights and inner rights as well. So I think that's exciting to see. The other element is how we hold and tap into and reach to the differently minded. I think that's the big work of our time. If you're a neoliberal or whatever, you're all in the same tent. What's the language that's going to bind us together? You know, and there's a beautiful poem by Rumi, you know, there's a field out there beyond right and wrong, I'll meet you there. Yeah, there's a field out there beyond right and wrong, and I'll meet you there. So what's the language of connection and meaning? And then my last point is something, obviously, that I'm very passionate with, being born in Mauritius. And ritual is very important to me in my life. And I think we'll be evolving new rituals collectively in the future. And I'm talking about the arts, and I'm talking about meaning making, and I'm talking about beauty making, and I'm talking about awe and delight and a sense of wonder. So this doesn't take a lot of money, but it takes heart and it takes gifting and care. So, you know, I'm quietly excited and also anxious in this time, because a lot of people are in pain and struggling, and we're going to need to really look after our brothers and sisters in this time of this deep and extraordinary change. So there you go, folks. I've given you a little bit of a snapshot and hopefully a bit of a taste test of what's to come. And I think what's exciting is that we're still making it up, you know. In some ways, I'm making it up as I go along, but I'm not afraid to be vulnerable and to give it a shot and to step in that space. And it's going to take all of us together in that collective wisdom to come together and be in a messy environment to make it up together. But I think in that sense, we're in a very rare opportunity that gives us the oxygen and a breath to really start breathing life into this new space. So thank you. So I'll pass it to you, Michelle, to open up hopefully for some rich dialogue.